The reflection in the storefront window caught me off guard. Designer blazer, perfectly styled hair, briefcase that cost more than my first car. Sometimes I still couldn't believe this was me. 10 years ago, I'd been Katie Mitchell, small-town girl from Cedar Grove, Indiana, wearing outlet store clothes and trying to hide my accent in corporate meetings. Mrs. Reynolds, the barista called out my name, my married name, and I turned away from my reflection to grab my almond milk latte. Another reminder of how far I'd come from the girl who used to drink gas station coffee. My phone buzzed. Speaking of reminders, Eleanor Reynolds, my mother-in-law's name, flashed across the screen. The same woman who'd once told me I wasn't good enough for her precious son Andrew now wanted to meet for lunch, again. "I know you're busy, Catherine," her voicemail began. She'd never call me Katie. "But the country club is having their spring social next weekend, and I'd love for you to be my guest." I smiled, remembering the first time she'd seen me in her precious country club. The look on her face had been worth every minute of the previous 5 years. "Of course, Mother Reynolds," I texted back, knowing the formal address would make her smile. "I'll check my calendar and let you know." I slipped my phone into my Hermes bag, a gift from Andrew after my last promotion, and headed toward the glass and steel tower that housed Reynolds and Associates. My heels clicked against the marble lobby floor as security nodded their greetings. A decade ago, I'd walked through these same doors as a junior accountant, fresh out of Indiana State, wearing my only professional outfit and carrying a Target briefcase. "Morning, Miss Katie." Jorge, the elevator operator, greeted me with a warm smile. He was one of the few people who still called me Katie, and I loved him for it. "Big meeting today?" "The biggest," I replied, straightening my shoulders. "Board presentation." "You'll knock 'em dead," he said with a wink. Just like always, the elevator climbed to the 47th floor, where my corner office awaited. CFO of Reynolds and Associates, a position Eleanor had once told Andrew would never go to someone like her. My assistant Lisa jumped up as I approached. "Your brother called, twice, says it's about Mom." The mention of my mother sent a familiar pang through my chest. She'd passed away 6 years ago, never getting to see me become the woman I am today. But she believed in me when nobody else did, working double shifts at the diner to help put me through college. "Thanks, Lisa. Any other messages?" "Mrs. Reynolds, your mother-in-law, called to confirm she received your text, and Mr. Reynolds wants to know if you're free for lunch." I smiled at the mention of Andrew. After 12 years of marriage, he still asked me to lunch like we were dating. "Tell him yes, but it'll have to be quick. I need to review the quarterly projections before the board meeting." I walked into my office, setting my coffee on the custom oak desk that had once belonged to Eleanor's father. The irony wasn't lost on me. My office view stretched across downtown Chicago, the lake a glimmering blue line in the distance. I pulled up the quarterly reports on my dual monitors, but my mind drifted to the voicemail from my brother Jack. "Katie, it's about Mom's old house," he said when I called back. "Remember how you said you wanted to turn it into a scholarship foundation?" Of course. I'd been working on the plans for months. The Eleanor Mitchell Scholarship for Working Class Women, named after our mother, who'd never gotten her own chance at college. Well, the zoning board finally approved it. "We can move forward whenever you're ready." Tears pricked at my eyes. That's perfect, Jack, thank you. Mom would be proud, you know. Not just of this, but everything. I glanced at the family photo on my desk. Mom in her diner uniform, Jack in his mechanic's coveralls, me in my graduation gown. I hope so. A knock at my door interrupted my memories. Andrew stood there, his tie slightly crooked like always. Some things never changed, even after he became CEO. "Ready for lunch, gorgeous?" He grinned, that same boyish smile that had caught my eye at the company Christmas party 13 years ago. "Just let me grab my coat." I stood, catching my reflection in the window. "Your mother invited me to the country club social." Andrew's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Quite a change from when she tried to have you blacklisted from membership." "Sometimes I think that's why she likes me now," I said, falling into step beside him. "Because I proved her wrong without ever throwing it in her face." "No," Andrew replied, pressing the elevator button. "She likes you because you proved her wrong while making the company more successful than it's ever been." The restaurant was one of those power lunch spots where deals were made over $50 salads. As we settled into our corner booth, I spotted Eleanor across the room with her usual ladies who lunch crowd. She caught my eye and waved, genuine warmth in her expression. "Remember when she used to pretend not to see me in public?" I murmured to Andrew. "Remember when she hired a private investigator to look into your background?" I laughed softly. "Found out my mother was a waitress, and my father was a deadbeat who left when I was 2. Must have been quite the scandal. You know what she told me last week? Andrew took a sip of water. She said you're the best thing that ever happened to this family. Not just the company, the family. I nearly choked on my sparkling water. Eleanor Reynolds said that? She did, and she meant it. Though she'll probably deny it if you bring it up. After lunch, I headed straight to the boardroom. Our newest acquisition was waiting for my final approval. A small but innovative tech firm that would diversify our portfolio. As I presented the numbers, I could feel Eleanor watching from her seat at the table. She'd retired from active management 5 years ago, but as chairman emeritus, she still attended major meetings. I'd learned to read her expressions over the years. Today, there was something like pride in her eyes. The projection models suggest a 40% increase in revenue within 18 months, I concluded, clicking to my final slide. Any questions? The room was silent. Then Eleanor spoke up. I believe Miss Reynolds has covered everything thoroughly. Unless there are objections, I move to approve the acquisition. The vote was unanimous. As people filed out, Eleanor lingered. Catherine, do you have a moment? Of course, I said, gathering my papers. The boardroom emptied until it was just us, the current and former queens of Reynolds and Associates, as the business magazines like to say. I received the invitation to the Scholarship Foundation launch, Eleanor said, smoothing her perfectly tailored navy suit. The one you're creating in your mother's name. I tensed slightly. While Eleanor had softened over the years, discussions about my background still felt fraught with potential landmines. I'd like to make a contribution, she continued. A significant one. I blinked, unsure I'd heard correctly. That's very generous. Your mother put you through college on a waitress's salary, Eleanor said quietly. She gave us our CFO. The least I can do is help other women like her do the same for their daughters. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. A decade of transformation, hers as much as mine, distilled into one moment. I was wrong about you, Eleanor said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Not just about your capabilities, but about who you are. I was so focused on where you came from that I couldn't see where you were going. I sat down slowly, my legs suddenly unsteady. In 10 years of gradually thawing relations, she'd never been this direct about her past behavior. I judged you based on your accent, your clothes, your family background, she continued. I thought Andrew was making a terrible mistake. Instead, she smiled wryly. Instead, he made the best decision of his life. And now I don't just call you my daughter-in-law, I call you my successor. My throat tightened. Eleanor, the board agrees. We want you to be the next CEO when Andrew steps up to chairman. The words hit me like a physical force. CEO of Reynolds and Associates. The position Eleanor had held for 30 years before passing it to Andrew. The role she'd once said would never go to someone from a background like yours. But Andrew, I started, was the one who suggested it, Eleanor finished. He says he's ready to focus on board-level strategy, and you're better suited to day-to-day operations. The numbers support that. The company's performance under your financial leadership has been extraordinary. I thought about my mother, working those double shifts at the diner, about the way she'd smile even when her feet were killing her, telling me, "Baby, you're going to go so far." Does the board? I hesitated. Do they all support this? Unanimously, Eleanor said, though I suspect some of them are still a bit afraid of you after that merger you engineered last year. When would this happen? I asked, my mind already racing with possibilities. The announcement would be at the annual shareholders meeting next month. You'd assume the role at the start of the next fiscal year. Eleanor reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Here's the formal proposal. I opened it, scanning the details. The compensation package was staggering, more money than my mother had made in her entire life. There's something else, Eleanor said, pulling out another envelope. Andrew doesn't know about this part yet. Inside was a deed. I recognized the address. It was for Eleanor's beloved summer house in Lake Forest, the one where she'd refused to invite us for the first 3 years of my marriage to Andrew. I'm putting it in your name, she said. You've more than earned your place in this family. I stared at the deed, memories flooding back. The first time I'd visited that house, after Eleanor finally relented, I'd been so intimidated by its grandeur that I'd barely spoken. Now she was giving it to me. I don't know what to say, I managed. Say you'll accept both offers. Eleanor's eyes, so like Andrew's, held mine. The CEO position and the house. Though I expect you'll redecorate, my taste is rather outdated. A laugh bubbled up through my tears. Your taste is impeccable. Catherine. She reached across the table and took my hand, something she'd never done before. When I think of how close I came to driving you away in those early years, I thank God every day that you were stronger than my prejudice. The intercom buzzed, making us both jump. Lisa's voice came through. Miss Reynolds, your 3 o'clock is here. Give me 5 minutes, I called back, wiping my eyes carefully. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt. I'll let you get back to work. But before I go, she pulled one more thing from her briefcase, a small, worn photograph. Andrew found this in some old files. It was a picture from that first Christmas party where I'd met Andrew. I was wearing a dress I'd saved 3 months to buy, my hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Andrew was grinning at me across a crowded room, clearly smitten, and in the background, Eleanor stood with a group of board members, watching us with obvious disapproval. I keep this to remind myself never to judge someone's potential by their starting point, Eleanor said softly. You've taught me that, Catherine. You've taught all of us that. I touched the photo gently. Would you believe I still have this dress? Keep it, she said. Perhaps you can wear it when you announce the Scholarship Foundation. Back in my office, I sank into my chair, the events of the afternoon swirling in my head. CEO, the lake house, Eleanor's transformation from judgmental mother-in-law to champion. It felt surreal. I pulled out my phone and called Jack. Hey, big brother, got a minute? For my baby sister? Always. Especially now that you're basically running Chicago. His familiar laugh grounded me. They want me to be CEO, I said quietly. And Eleanor, she's giving me her lake house. There was a long pause. Mom would be doing cartwheels right now, he finally said, his voice rough. Remember how she used to tell everyone at the diner that her daughter was going to run a company someday? They all thought she was crazy, I remembered, smiling through tears. Especially when I was wearing that awful polyester uniform and dropping plates. Shows what they knew, Jack said. So when do you take over? Next fiscal year. There's going to be an announcement at the shareholders' meeting. Want me to come? I'll even wear a tie. I laughed. You hate ties. Yeah, but I love you. And I want to see the faces of all those people who looked down their noses at us when you first started dating Andrew. I glanced at the photo Eleanor had given me. Most of them have changed, like Eleanor. Speaking of the former Ice Queen, how's she handling all this? It was her idea. Well, hers and Andrew's. I paused. She apologized today for how she treated me in the beginning. Hell really has frozen over, Jack whistled. Next thing you know, she'll be eating at Mom's old diner. Actually, I smiled. That's not a bad idea. The next morning, I stopped by Eleanor's office before my first meeting. She looked up from her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose. Catherine, is everything all right? I'd like to take you to lunch, I said. Not at La Maison or the club. Somewhere different. She raised an eyebrow but reached for her calendar. What did you have in mind? The Blue Plate Diner. I watched her face carefully. Where my mom used to work. Understanding dawned in her eyes. The diner had survived, even thrived, though Mom was long gone. Her best friend Rose still ran it, keeping the same worn leather booths and chrome counters that had been there since the 1950s. It's not exactly your usual style, I added, but they make the best meatloaf in Chicago. Eleanor closed her calendar. What time shall we go? The lunch rush was in full swing when we walked into the Blue Plate. The bell above the door jangled, and the familiar smell of coffee and grilled onions wrapped around me like a hug. Katie Mitchell, Rose's voice boomed across the diner. As I live and breathe. She hurried over, her gray hair escaping from its net, her aproned form exactly as I remembered. Then she spotted Eleanor and stopped short, recognition flooding her face. Mrs. Reynolds, she said, her tone changing. Welcome to the Blue Plate. Eleanor smiled, a real smile, not her society one. Please, call me Eleanor. Catherine tells me you make the best meatloaf in Chicago. Rose's eyes darted between us, taking in our matching designer handbags and Eleanor's relaxed demeanor. Your regular booth is open, Katie, the one where your mama used to take her breaks. Eleanor slid into the vinyl booth, looking completely out of place yet somehow perfectly at ease. Her Chanel suit stood out against the weathered red vinyl, but her smile remained genuine as she studied the laminated menu. Your mother worked the afternoon shift? She asked, glancing around the bustling diner. Double shifts, usually, 2 to close. I ran my hand along the table's edge. She'd let me do my homework right here after school. Rose would slip me chocolate milkshakes when Mom wasn't looking. Still make 'em the same way, Rose called from behind the counter. Extra malt, Just how you like it. Eleanor set down her menu. I'll have what Catherine's having. And perhaps one of those chocolate malts? I stared at her. Eleanor Reynolds, who usually sipped mineral water with lunch, was ordering a diner malt. Mom would have loved this, I said softly. She always believed people could change. Tell me about her, Eleanor said, surprising me again. Not just the basics I learned from that investigator. I'm still mortified about that, by the way. Tell me about your mother, the real Eleanor Mitchell. Rose brought our malts, lingering for a moment. Want me to show Mrs. Reynolds the wall? I nodded, and Rose led us to a corner near the register. There, among dozens of faded photographs of diner regulars and staff, was a picture of my mother in her blue plate uniform, her arm around a teenage me at my high school graduation. She put every spare penny into Catherine's education, Rose explained to Eleanor. Worked sick, worked holidays, worked through everything. Used to say her girl was going to be somebody important someday. Eleanor touched the photograph gently. She was right. Damn straight she was, Rose said. Ellie would have loved seeing her daughter become CEO of Reynolds and Associates. How did you know about that? I asked Rose, surprised. The CEO announcement wasn't public yet. Rose winked. Honey, I may run a diner, but I read the business section. Plus, your brother can't keep a secret to save his life. Back at our booth, Eleanor took a long sip of her chocolate malt. This is extraordinary, she admitted. I haven't had one since college. Our meatloaf arrived, steam rising from the thick slices. Eleanor took a bite and closed her eyes. Oh my. Told you? I said, grinning. You know, Eleanor said thoughtfully, cutting another piece, we should cater the Scholarship Foundation launch from here. Remind everyone where it all started. I nearly dropped my fork. You want to serve diner food at a Reynolds event? Why not? It's authentic. It's meaningful. She gestured around the diner. This place helped create one of Chicago's most successful CEOs. I'd say that makes it worthy of celebration. Besides, Eleanor continued, I think it's time Reynolds and Associates remembered its own history. Your father-in-law started as a janitor's son, you know. Something I conveniently forgot when I was busy judging your background. I didn't know that. In all her years of strained relationship and eventual reconciliation, she'd never mentioned it. William worked nights cleaning offices to put himself through business school, she said quietly. He built Reynolds and Associates from nothing. That's why he liked you from the start, even when I was being difficult. I never knew, I said softly. No one did. I was so focused on maintaining our social position that I buried that part of our history. Eleanor dabbed her lips with a paper napkin. Until you came along and reminded us what the American dream really means.